Hi, good afternoon. My name is Gary from Kingdom Evangelism. I would like to invite you to a very exciting series. We're at part 2 on God's Prosperity Covenant, part 2. Just overviewing some of the things that we did. We looked at Deuteronomy 8 and verse 18, which says, I am the Lord thy God, that giveth thee power to get wealth, that I may establish thy covenant with you. Now, I've often heard Christians say, Father, give me money to get wealth. The problem with this prayer, rather, give me power to become wealthy. The problem with that prayer is that I think it's the wrong prayer, because God, according to Deuteronomy 8 verse 18, has already given us the power to get wealth. The problem, I think, is we haven't fulfilled the other aspect of the verse. God has fulfilled his part by giving us power. We haven't fulfilled the covenant aspect of it. And this is what's critical about God's prosperity covenant, is God wants to have a covenant with us, through which he can then exchange his wealth. Because it's about kingdom. It's not about personal aggrandizement. So this is what we want to focus on. And we have been doing some teaching in this. Now, be diligent to find on our Twitter channel and YouTube channel, King's Evangelism. And there is a current broadcast, part 1 out on God's Prosperity Covenant. If you get that, you'll get into detail of what we were focusing on our last teaching. So this is a building in part 2 on what we covered before. Also, we looked at Genesis chapter 8 verse 22, where it says, as long as the earth remain, there shall be seed time and harvest. As long as the earth remain. So this is a foundation system put in place for God to establish a covenant relationship through us. And he's tied this not to the Old Testament, as many people believe, or to the New Testament. It goes beyond both the Old and New Testament, because it says, as long as the earth remain. The principle of seed time and harvest is not just applicable to the agrarian livestock industry, but is applicable to finances. That is, that we establish a relationship via our covenant relationship that God uses to prosper believers. In other words, there is a direct system in place for believers to prosper. If we follow it, God will prosper us. The problem, however, is with the lack of covenant relationship. Now I'm going to move on to Genesis chapter 47 and let's give you a snippet of what we really want to cover in detail. Genesis 47, there was famine. In other words, there was a global economic crisis taking place during the nation of Egypt. Pharaoh was the leader or prime minister, and we have Joseph being one of the people that God chose to prosper. Now you might have remembered that Joseph went to prison. He was lied upon by Potiphar's wife, and then he came from prison, came out of slavery where his brothers had sold him, and then after he emerged as a great leader, second to Pharaoh, which is at that time was like the second statesman to the person in charge, who was Pharaoh. Now you see where he introduces his family to Pharaoh. He then decides to position his 5 brothers for Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asks a very interesting question. He says in Genesis 47 verse 3, what is your occupation? In other words, survival meant on an occupation or a skill. So believers had a skill, they had a talent, they had something that God could use as a point of contact to prosper them. In Genesis 47, a very exciting and interesting text. We see where Joseph introduces his father to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh does something very interesting. He says to Joseph, "We have come to live here for a while because of the famine. It is very severe in Canaan, and your servants have no pastor, so please let your servant settle in Goshen." So this conversation is a very interesting build-up to what actually happens during the time of this famine. Now, this is a very relevant story to what we are going through at this particular time. There was a great financial crisis, or a Great Depression, and the inflation was so much that the value of the currency had eroded to the point that they had to instigate a barter system. A barter system is where you exchange your current substance for something else that you don't have. Economics puts it like this: you exchange something that you have in exchange for something you do not have. So this barter system was put in place to establish a wealth transfer from the people of Egypt. However, regardless of the poverty that took place, Joseph was extremely prosperous. Now here is what Joseph does, which is very interesting to what can be practiced today. Joseph establishes not just a barter system, he establishes what I call a commodities exchange commission. He puts in place a strategy to exchange livestock for food. So because the value of the currency had become so low, money, or the purchasing power of money, was so low that it required a different system that had value. In other words, we can only do business if we have something of value. Joseph set about putting in place a system of exchange. The first thing he does is that he exchanges livestock. How amazing. So what Joseph did was to ask them to exchange livestock. In verse 13, in verse 12 rather, of verse 47, so Joseph provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. So first he looks after his family, which is very important and very key. The second thing he does in verse 16, he brings livestock. He sells them food in exchange for livestock. Genesis 47 and verse 16. He says, since you have no money, or the value of your money has been eroded, I will take your livestock. I will take your cattle. I will take your sheep. I will take your horses in exchange for food. So these people were obviously desperate because of the value of the currency has eroded, a bit like the 1930s of Great Depression. Now, it tells me here that during a Great Depression or economic crisis, the most important thing obviously is not money. The most important asset is to have something of value. In this case, they have livestock. Now, this is the first example of a stock exchange. I never saw this before. In verse 18, Joseph goes on more to talk about the system of livestock and how he chooses to exchange value, a valuable commodity, in exchange for purchasing land. He says in verse 19, in verse 47, beg your pardon, in Genesis 47 verse 19, he says, why should we perish before your eyes? They said to him, we and our land as well. Buy us, buy us, and our land in exchange for food. And we, with our land, will be in bondage to Pharaoh. So Joseph sets up a system. He says, they said to him, give us seed so that we may live and not die. Amazing. Give us seed. Give us seed so that we may live and not die. So what was most important? The most important commodity here was not money. It was something of value. And what they had of value to perpetuate a new system was seed. Seed was most important to bring about a new harvest for the next season. What we need in a time of financial crisis is not necessarily money. We need seed, we need a covenant relationship, and we need these two items as an element of exchange to bring about God's financial system. So God's financial system is not predicated on money. God's financial system is based on, one, a seed, and two, a covenant relationship. Exciting? If you want to hear more about this amazing teaching, we are going to expose the actual lies in the prosperity doctrine. And we're going to talk to you about what is necessary to bring about investment, trading, and a strong covenant relationship to prosper in good times as well as bad times. Why don't you follow us and subscribe? Bring someone along to our next teaching. On Sunday, we're going to expose part 2 on God's prosperity covenant. Stay tuned. This is Kingdom Evangelism. God bless you.